quiet night near the Temple of Artemis, long after the crowds. Night arrives without coordination. It does not consult the city or wait for permission. In Ephesus, long after the streets forgot how to be busy, darkness settles with professional ease. Stones cool, air thickens slightly, sound retreats until it becomes optional. This is not the kind of night people once traveled for. No schedule depends on it. No reputation is at stake. The city does not prepare. It simply allows the dark to do what it has always done best, which is lower expectations. This is the hour late night history prefers, not because something dramatic is about to happen, but because nothing is. The absence of urgency creates a rare clarity. When a place no longer needs to impress anyone, it finally starts behaving honestly. Ephesus at night does not perform. It rests. And in that rest, it reveals how cities look when they stop trying to be remembered. The area near the Temple of Artemis is quieter than the rest. It has been that way for a long time. The ground remembers crowds but does not miss them. Pathways that once absorbed thousands of footsteps now receive only the occasional passerby who has no particular reason to be there. Stone edges are softened by time, not by use. Nothing here asks for attention. Nothing here resists being ignored. This quiet did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. Years layered themselves gently, one unremarkable season after another, until noise simply lost the argument. The city did not collapse into silence. It drifted there. That distinction matters. Collapse leaves traces. Drift leaves habits. And habit is harder to reverse. Once this place was designed to handle abundance. Space was calculated for volume, for bodies, for movement, for repetition. The architecture assumed crowds the way lungs assume air. Now that assumption has expired. The structures remain, but they operate under a different logic. They no longer expect arrival. They tolerate presence. That is a significant downgrade, and also a relief. At night, the scale feels slightly excessive. Columns that once framed human activity now frame nothing in particular. They stand with the patience of objects that have learned not to anticipate applause. The ground holds its shape without needing explanation. No one narrates what this place used to be. The stones are not interested in reenactment. They have already done their part. The irony is subtle and polite. A site built to impress now excels at being overlooked. Grandeur has been reduced to background, not destroyed, just demoted. It turns out that time does not always erase. Sometimes it simply reassigns importance. There are no dramatic shadows here, no theatrical lighting. Darkness is evenly distributed, like a service provided by the atmosphere. It does not highlight, it softens. Details dissolve into suggestion. Edges lose confidence. This is not mystery, it is efficiency. The night does not waste energy clarifying what no longer needs to be clear. Sound behaves similarly. Footsteps are absorbed rather than echoed. A breeze moves through grass that has no story attached to it. Insects perform their small duties without audience awareness. The night does not amplify. It compresses. It takes a place once stretched wide by human attention and folds it inward until it fits comfortably within itself. People who pass through do not linger. They do not pause to consider significance. They walk as they would anywhere else, which is exactly the point. The extraordinary has finally been treated as ordinary, and the result is calm. When something stops demanding recognition, it becomes easier to live alongside. There is a practical humor in that. A structure that once required constant explanation now requires none. No guides, no speeches, no raised voices, just stone doing what stone does when left alone. It holds temperature. It holds shape. It waits without expectation. The city beyond this area continues its reduced rhythm. Lights appear in windows for reasons unrelated to history. Conversations happen that do not reference the past. Life moves forward in narrow, manageable increments. The Temple of Artemis no longer organizes time or space. It coexists. That is a quieter role, but also a more sustainable one. Nothing here is trying to teach a lesson. Nothing is offering a warning. This night does not contain wisdom. It contains duration, and duration is often misinterpreted as meaning. In reality, it is simply what happens when things are allowed to continue without interruption. Late night history values this distinction. Not every surviving structure carries a message. Some are just leftovers that adapted well enough to avoid removal. Their presence is not symbolic. It is logistical. And that practicality is strangely comforting. It suggests that not everything that lasts needs to justify itself. The longer the night stretches, the more the place settles into neutrality. Neutrality is underrated. It lacks drama. It lacks urgency. But it is stable. The ground does not shift beneath it. The mind does not have to work to interpret it. Neutral spaces allow rest because they do not require response. This is why the quiet feels safe. Not because it promises anything, but because it demands nothing. There is no performance to keep up with, no reaction expected. Just the steady agreement between darkness and stone that neither will make a scene. If you listen carefully, you might notice how little effort the night is making. That is intentional. Effort attracts attention. Attention invites memory. And memory tends to exaggerate. This place has already experienced enough exaggeration for several lifetimes. The night continues. It does not build toward anything. It does not resolve. It simply remains present until it is replaced by something else, likely without ceremony. That is how most nights end here, quietly, efficiently, without needing to be recalled. Before you drift any deeper, if this calm makes you feel steady tonight, you are welcome to stay. Remaining here gently keeps this place soft and allows these quiet hours to continue. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to remember. Just let the night handle itself, the way it has learned to do so well. Now rest. Ephesus after the applause. Ephesus once behaved like a city that expected to be noticed. It was built with the confidence of a place that assumed arrival. Roads widened where they did not need to. Open spaces were generous, almost optimistic. Movement was constant enough that stillness never had a chance to practice. The city learned early that attention would come to it, and so it never learned how to sit quietly with itself. During its most active years, Ephesus depended on flow. People passed through, stopped briefly, then passed on again. Merchants adjusted their voices to match the density of bodies. Public areas were shaped by repetition rather than reflection. Nothing stayed empty long enough to feel unnecessary. The city measured its success by how little silence it contained. This kind of success is demanding. A city that thrives on movement must always be ready for more of it. Streets remain alert. Buildings expect use. Space becomes a promise rather than a pause. In Ephesus, quiet was not a skill. It was a problem to be solved. Crowds are efficient teachers. They instruct a place on how to respond quickly, how to absorb pressure, how to keep things moving without asking why. Ephesus learned these lessons well. It became fluent in accommodation. It knew how to host. It knew how to receive. What it never practiced was how to remain when receiving was no longer required. The change did not arrive with ceremony. There was no moment when the city realized it had stopped being a destination. That realization belongs to hindsight, and cities rarely have time for that. Instead, the shift happened gradually, in ways too small to announce. Fewer arrivals one season, shorter stays the next. Paths that once wore smooth under constant use began to hold their shape longer. At first, the city adjusted. It always had. Less noise meant less effort. Fewer visitors meant fewer demands. The infrastructure remained ready, just in case. Ephesus had grown accustomed to preparation. It did not immediately accept that preparation was no longer necessary. Over time, readiness turned into habit. Habit turned into routine, and routine, when left unchallenged, becomes background. The city continued to function, but without urgency. Streets existed without expectation. Buildings stood without anticipating purpose. Space became available rather than occupied. This is when silence begins to settle in, not dramatically, but patiently. Silence does not rush. It waits until nothing is actively resisting it. In Ephesus, resistance faded quietly. The city stopped projecting itself outward and began folding inward instead. The absence of crowds changed the scale of things. Distances felt longer without bodies to break them up. Open areas felt larger than necessary. Architecture that once framed human movement now framed air. The city did not shrink, but it felt less dense, as though its own importance had dispersed. There is a mild humor in watching a place adjust to being overlooked. Ephesus had been very good at being impressive. It had invested heavily in that skill. When the audience thinned, the city did not panic. It simply continued standing, which turned out to be enough. Places that lose attention often gain something else in return. They gain time. Without constant interruption, surfaces age more evenly. Sounds soften. The city begins to hear itself again, usually for the first time. Ephesus discovered that it had an internal rhythm that did not depend on traffic or trade. That rhythm was slower. It did not reward urgency. It did not escalate. Days passed without notable distinction. Nights arrived without anticipation. This kind of continuity is difficult to notice when things are busy. Only when movement slows does repetition become visible. The city had once relied on external validation. Its identity was reinforced by arrival and recognition. Without those, it was forced to operate on something closer to self-containment. That adjustment was not philosophical. It was practical. Less attention simply meant less to manage. Streets that had once guided people toward landmarks now guided no one in particular. They became routes rather than statements. Buildings no longer introduced themselves. They waited. Waiting, it turns out, is easier than maintaining relevance. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of demand. In Ephesus, demand diminished until it vanished altogether. What remained was a city that no longer expected to be approached. It existed without invitation. This is the version of Ephesus that Knight prefers. Not the celebrated one, but the functional one. A place that does not perform sleeps better. Without the pressure of being seen, the city relaxed into its own dimensions. It stopped trying to explain itself. The transition from destination to background is rarely discussed, but it is common. Most places do not disappear. They simply stopped being required. Ephesus joined that quiet majority. It did not lose its form, it lost its audience. And in that loss, something subtle occurred. The city became easier to inhabit even if fewer people chose to do so. The absence of crowds removed friction. Without constant use, the city aged honestly. No part of it needed to pretend. Ephesus no longer offered spectacle, it offered space, and space, when left alone long enough, becomes calm. Calm does not ask to be admired. It waits to be noticed, and even then, it does not insist. By the time night settles over the city, there is no trace of expectation left. The streets are not disappointed. The buildings are not bored. The city has learned to exist without commentary. It is no longer a destination. It is simply a place, and that turns out to be more than enough. The city did not notice the applause ending. That detail matters. Ephesus did not experience a moment of realization or a collective pause. There was no evening when everyone agreed that fewer people were arriving and that fewer still were staying. The change happened the way most changes do in places that have existed for a long time, quietly and without witnesses who felt important enough to remember it later. After the crowds thinned, the city continued out of habit. Roads remained open. Corners stayed in place. Walls held their positions without complaint. Everything that had been built to manage abundance learned to function with absence instead. This adjustment did not require discussion. Stone does not debate necessity. It adapts or it waits. Movement became optional. Streets no longer relied on footsteps to justify their width. Paths that once guided steady streams of bodies learned to accept emptiness as a valid condition. The city discovered that it could still exist even when it was not being used at full capacity. That discovery arrived slowly, but once it settled, it stayed. Silence did not announce itself. It accumulated. It arrived in small increments. A pause between footsteps that lasted a little longer than usual. A morning that opened without the sound of preparation. An evening that closed without urgency. None of these moments felt significant on their own. Together they formed a pattern that no one bothered to name. Ephesus had once measured time through activity. Now time moved without reference. Days passed without marking themselves as special or disappointing. The city no longer needed to respond to arrival or departure. It simply maintained its shape and allowed hours to move across it. There is a mild irony in how smoothly this worked. A place designed to impress proved equally capable of being ignored. Grandeur did not vanish. It just stopped asking to be acknowledged. Columns still stood where they always had. Open spaces still waited where they always had. The only difference was that nothing felt compelled to pass through them. People who remained nearby adjusted without comment. Fewer voices required less volume. Fewer transactions required less negotiation. Life continued at a reduced scale that felt almost reasonable. When pressure disappears, efficiency improves. Ephesus became better at being still than it had ever been at being busy. The city did not resist this transition. Resistance requires energy, and energy is rarely wasted on conditions that do not hurt. Absence was not painful, it was neutral. Neutrality can feel unsettling to those who prefer explanation, but places rarely share that preference. They operate on endurance, not narrative. Night became easier once there was less to manage. Without crowds, darkness no longer had to accommodate noise or motion. It could spread evenly. Shadows settled into predictable positions. Sounds behaved themselves. Nothing echoed excessively because nothing needed to be heard. This is when the city began to feel honest, not idealized and not diminished, just present. Without constant use, surfaces aged naturally. Without attention, structures stopped performing. Ephesus did not shrink. It relaxed. The absence of crowds changed how distance felt. A short walk became longer. An open area felt wider than necessary. These sensations did not produce awe or disappointment. They simply existed. The city allowed space to behave like space again. What remained was a rhythm that no longer depended on participation. The city did not wait for approval. It did not require explanation. It existed because it had not been removed, and that turned out to be sufficient. There is quiet humor in that simplicity. Entire generations once organized themselves around this place. Now it stood content with being passed by without notice. Importance had faded, but structure remained. The city learned that significance is temporary, but layout is stubborn. Streets continued to connect places, even when those places no longer mattered to anyone in particular. Buildings continued to enclose air, whether or not someone needed shelter at that moment. Infrastructure revealed its true purpose when stripped of attention. It existed to remain usable, not to be admired. Silence settled deeper as nights repeated themselves without interruption. Repetition is persuasive. Over time, it convinces even the most elaborate spaces to stop insisting on relevance. Ephesus learned this lesson thoroughly. The city stopped projecting meaning outward and allowed meaning to dissolve inward instead. Nothing collapsed, nothing concluded. The decline was so gentle it barely qualified as decline at all. It was closer to a redistribution of energy. Less effort here, less response there, until effort itself became unnecessary. The city no longer anticipated arrival. Anticipation had been replaced by availability. That shift made everything easier. No expectations meant no disappointment. No disappointment meant no urgency. The city settled into a stable neutrality that required little maintenance. By the time night wrapped itself fully around Ephesus, there was no tension left in the streets. They were not waiting. They were not remembering. They simply held their position as they always had. This was not a loss in the dramatic sense. It was an adjustment, one that allowed the city to continue without effort. Ephesus, after the applause, became something quieter and more durable, a place that no longer needed to be used in order to exist. When a monument stops, knowing what it is for, the structure remained long after its purpose grew unclear. That was not unusual. Buildings rarely leave when meaning does. Stone is patient in ways people are not. It stays even after the reasons for staying have expired. Near the former heart of Ephesus, the great structure continued to occupy space with confidence, even as the city around it learned how to function without needing it. At first, nothing looked different. The building stood where it always had. Its dimensions did not shrink. Its materials did not apologize. From a distance, it still suggested importance. But importance is not a physical quality. It is an agreement. And agreements quietly dissolve when no one renews them. There was a time when this place organized movement. Paths led toward it. Schedules bent around it. People adjusted their pace as they approached. The structure did not merely exist. It directed. It informed behavior. It gave the surrounding space a hierarchy. That role faded not because the building failed, but because the city found other ways to orient itself. When a structure stops being central, it does not announce the change. It simply notices that fewer things depend on it. Foot traffic decreases without explanation. Maintenance becomes less urgent. Attention wanders. The building does not react. Reaction would imply awareness. Instead, it continues to stand and waits for the world to finish deciding what it needs. This waiting can last a very long time. The city adapted gradually. Life reorganized itself around more practical concerns. Markets shifted, routes shortened. Daily movement became efficient rather than ceremonial. The structure was no longer required to anchor collective behavior. It became optional scenery. That transition is subtle but decisive. A destination becomes a backdrop the moment people stop arriving with intention. They may still pass nearby. They may still glance in its direction. But their movement no longer bends toward it. It is no longer a reason. It is simply there. Architecture feels this change even if it cannot respond. Design choices once meant to impress now feel slightly excessive. Proportions calibrated for crowds begin to frame empty air. Spaces built to hold many bodies now hold light and shadow instead. The structure remains impressive, but only in the abstract sense. No one is impressed enough to stop. There is mild irony in how smoothly this demotion occurs. A building created to dominate public space adapts easily to being ignored. It does not collapse from lack of attention. It does not demand reinterpretation. It just continues doing what it has always done, holding its shape, absorbing weather, aging at a reasonable pace. In the absence of function, form becomes quiet. Details that once guided movement now serve no practical purpose. Steps no longer measure arrival. Platforms no longer elevate anything of consequence. The building stops instructing behavior. It becomes neutral. Neutrality is not failure. It is a different mode of existence, one that requires far less effort. Without an active role, the structure no longer needs to justify itself. It does not compete for relevance. It is freed from expectation. The surrounding city learns to live with this new arrangement quickly. People are efficient. They adjust routes. They ignore what no longer affects them. The structure becomes familiar in the way furniture does. Present, but not addressed. Useful only as reference. Turn left near the old stones. Slow down because the ground changes texture there. This is when architecture becomes landscape. Once that happens, the building no longer participates in time the way it used to. It stops marking events. It stops anchoring memory. Days pass around it without attaching themselves. The structure exists in a continuous present that is not particularly interested in narrative. At night, this quality becomes more noticeable. Without crowds, darkness settles evenly across the site. There is no focal point for attention, no reason for light to gather. The building blends into its surroundings. It is still large. It is still solid. But it does not stand out. This absence of emphasis is calming. When nothing demands interpretation, the mind rests. The structure no longer invites explanation. It no longer suggests significance. It simply occupies space in a way that feels resolved. There is a quiet humor in that resolution. Entire generations once argued over this place. Now it is content to be passed by without comment. It has outlived urgency. That is a kind of success rarely discussed. Buildings often fail by trying to remain relevant. This one did not. It accepted redundancy with grace. By no longer insisting on purpose, it preserved itself. No one felt the need to remove it. No one felt the need to repurpose it aggressively. It was left alone because it asked for nothing. In being left alone, it found stability. The city benefits from this arrangement as well. A structure that does not interfere is easy to coexist with. It does not disrupt flow. It does not demand resources. It simply exists as part of the environment. Familiar, predictable, quiet. The former center becomes a margin without resentment. That shift does not diminish the structure. It just places it correctly within the present. Not everything built for significance needs to retain it forever. As night continues, the building holds its position without effort. It does not reflect on what it used to be. It does not prepare for revival. It understands that survival does not require function, only endurance. In that sense, the structure is perfectly suited to the late hours. It has no message to deliver, no role to perform. It has already done its work and stepped aside. What remains is stone in the dark, calm, finished, and entirely comfortable with being part of the background rather than the reason anyone came. Stone does not remember what it was asked to mean. That is its advantage. After a monument stops knowing what it is for, the materials take over the responsibility of remaining. Columns continue to stand not because they symbolize anything, but because gravity still agrees with them. Foundations persist because removing them would require effort, and effort is rarely spent on things that no longer interfere. The city accepts this arrangement without comment. Once meaning withdraws, matter becomes easier to manage. There are no expectations attached to stone. No schedules depend on it. No arguments require its presence. It exists because it has not been cleared away, and that turns out to be a very stable reason. Silence gathers around materials like this, not as an event but as a condition. It settles into the gaps between columns. It fills the spaces where voices once stacked on top of one another. The quiet does not feel dramatic. It feels organized, predictable, the kind of quiet that does not surprise anyone who has lived nearby long enough. Foundations are especially good at this kind of patience. They are designed to be unseen, and they succeed even better when attention disappears entirely. Buried or exposed, they do not care. Their job was always to carry weight, not interpretation. Once the weight lessens, their work becomes easier. Columns behave differently. They remain visible even when their purpose dissolves. Standing without instruction, they appear almost polite. They hold their vertical lines without insisting on relevance. A column that no longer supports meaning becomes a visual pause, something the eye passes over without stopping. There is a faint humor in how little effort this requires. Entire systems once depended on these materials to convey importance. Now they convey nothing at all and still manage to survive. The stones do not mourn this demotion. They seem relieved. The ground beneath them changes slowly. Foot traffic thins. Wear patterns soften. Sharp edges lose confidence. None of this suggests neglect. It suggests adjustment. When pressure lifts, surfaces recover in their own quiet way. What remains is not abandonment but equilibrium. The space is not cared for and it is not destroyed. It occupies a middle state that feels sustainable. Too insignificant to renovate, too solid to remove. This is how many old places endure. Silence becomes the default because there is nothing left to interrupt it. No rituals to schedule. No gatherings to prepare for. The site does not need to respond to anything beyond weather and time. Both of those arrive without asking. Night reinforces this condition. Darkness treats stone evenly. It does not highlight intention. It reduces contrast. Columns lose their dramatic outlines. Foundations disappear into shadow. The space becomes less legible and more comfortable. comfort is an unexpected outcome here. A place stripped of significance can rest. Without the pressure to mean something, it becomes easier to exist within. The mind does not need to interpret. It can observe and then move on. Those who pass through rarely pause. Not because the space is hostile, but because it is complete. There is nothing missing that demands attention. The silence feels resolved. Lingering would add nothing. This kind of resolution is rare in places that once mattered. Many continue to insist on their past importance. They ask to be remembered. This one does not. It allows its materials to speak by remaining quiet. The city around it adapts naturally. Roots shift slightly. People learn where the ground is uneven, where shadows collect. The site becomes part of the landscape rather than a destination. That transition is efficient. No signs are required. Materials thrive in this state. Without constant interaction, they age honestly. No repairs to preserve appearance, no alterations to maintain relevance, just slow weathering that matches the pace of everything else. Silence does not erase history. It removes commentary. The stones still exist. The layout still holds. But nothing insists on being recalled. The past remains present without explanation. There is something steadying about that. When a place stops asking for attention, it stops competing with the present. It becomes compatible with it. The city does not have to choose between memory and movement. Both are allowed to coexist quietly. The longer this condition lasts, the more permanent it feels. Silence stops being noticeable. It becomes background. Visitors might describe the space as calm without knowing why. Residents stop describing it at all. This is how significance fades properly, not through destruction but through irrelevance. And irrelevance, it turns out, is gentle. It does not hurry. It does not argue. It simply waits until nothing objects. Stone excels at waiting. As time continues, the site remains exactly what it needs to be. Not central, not forgotten, just present. The materials hold their positions. The silence holds its shape. Nothing changes because nothing needs to. After a monument stops knowing what it is for, it does not disappear. It settles. And in settling, it becomes something far more durable than meaning. It becomes part of the quiet structure of the night. When the city learns how to sound again. Night sound behaves differently once the crowd leaves for good. It does not become louder to compensate. It becomes precise. In Ephesus, long after the noise lost its reason to exist, sound learned how to occupy space without competing for it. The city did not go silent. It simplified. During the busy years, sound had to fight for relevance. Voices stacked on top of one another, footsteps overlapped, tools answered tools. The air was always full of intention. Every noise wanted to be noticed because attention was currency. Silence was treated as inefficiency. That agreement ended quietly. Once the crowds thinned, sound lost its urgency. It no longer needed to announce purpose. There were fewer signals to transmit and fewer listeners to impress. What remained was not absence, but clarity. Each sound stood alone without interruption. Wind became audible again, not dramatically and not romantically. It moved through open space with no audience in mind. It touched stone because stone was there. It passed through grass because grass existed. The wind did not perform. It simply moved, and that movement was enough to be heard. Insects filled the smaller gaps. They did not coordinate. They did not synchronize. Each sound existed independently, and that independence made the night feel organized. Nothing overlapped unnecessarily. Nothing competed for dominance. The city discovered that unpredictability decreases when there is nothing left to rush. Footsteps appeared occasionally, one set at a time. They did not echo. They did not bounce dramatically off surfaces designed for volume. They landed and disappeared without commentary. The ground accepted them without reaction. The sound of walking returned to its original function, which was confirmation rather than announcement. This made the space easier to understand. When sound is scarce, it becomes informative. A single step tells you where someone is without exaggeration. A shifting breeze explains the layout of the open areas. Even silence develops texture. It is no longer empty. It is structured. There is a faint humor in how much effort once went into managing noise. Entire systems existed to amplify and contain sound. Once those systems were no longer needed, the city discovered it could operate on a simpler scale. Fewer adjustments, fewer corrections. Sound became cooperative. Night benefited the most. Without crowds, darkness no longer had to compete with activity. It did not need to soften edges or absorb chaos. It could settle evenly across the city. Sound followed its lead. Everything slowed down to a pace that felt deliberate rather than imposed. This made the environment predictable. Predictability is underrated. It does not excite, it reassures. When the same sounds return night after night without variation, the body relaxes. Nothing unexpected is about to happen because nothing has been scheduled to happen. The city no longer rehearsed for disruption. It stopped preparing for arrival. Without arrivals, sound had no need to escalate. It did not need to call attention or warn of movement. It existed in balance with space rather than in conflict with it. The absence of crowd noise also removed distortion. In busy places, sound lies. It exaggerates scale. It creates urgency where none exists. Once the crowd left, sound told the truth again. Distance sounded like distance. Space sounded like space. The city heard itself accurately for the first time in a long while. This accuracy had a calming effect. Without overlapping signals, the mind no longer had to filter aggressively. Listening became passive. The ear did not need to prioritize. Everything arrived at the same quiet volume, and nothing demanded immediate response. Even small noises gained dignity. A pebble shifting underfoot was no longer lost. Fabric brushing against stone registered without embarrassment. These sounds did not imply importance. They implied presence, and presence was sufficient. The city adjusted quickly. Buildings that once reflected sound now absorbed it. Surfaces learned new roles without being altered. Architecture adapted not through redesign, but through reduced demand. When fewer sounds strike a wall, the wall becomes softer without changing. There is an irony here that feels appropriate. The city had been designed to project sound outward, to amplify movement, to carry voices across distance. Once the need vanished, that same design supported quiet. Wide spaces allowed sound to dissipate gently. Stone absorbed more than it returned. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Wind, insects, an occasional step. No variations large enough to disrupt rest. Repetition built trust. The city became reliable. Reliable places do not need to announce themselves. Silence did not erase activity. It reframed it. Everything that happened did so without urgency. There was no background noise to rush decisions. No constant reminder that time was being wasted. The night extended without pressure. This is how a place becomes easy to sleep near, not by becoming empty, but by becoming legible. When sound aligns with expectation, the mind stops scanning for threats. Nothing is hidden because nothing is trying to hide. The city did not plan this outcome. It arrived naturally once sound no longer had to serve crowds. What remained was a nighttime environment that functioned on honesty rather than performance. In this version of Ephesus, sound does not impress. It informs. It does not interrupt. It accompanies. Each noise knows its place and stays there without protest. The night continues this arrangement without effort. No one needs to maintain it. No authority enforces it. It persists because it works. When a city learns how to sound again, it does not become louder or quieter. It becomes accurate. And accuracy at night is one of the most calming conditions a place can offer. After sound learned restraint, light followed, not immediately and not dramatically. Light does not rush to adapt. It waits until it is no longer required to perform. In the city, once sound stopped competing for attention, illumination quietly abandoned its ambition as well. There was a time when light existed to guide crowds. It stretched across streets to signal safety and direction. It highlighted entrances. It marked importance. Light once acted as an invitation and occasionally as a warning. It told people where to gather and when to move. In a city shaped by arrival, light had responsibilities. Those responsibilities dissolved gradually. As movement thinned, illumination lost its urgency. Lamps were no longer calibrated for spectacle. Their purpose shifted from announcement to allowance. Light became just enough to see where the ground changed, enough to recognize a wall before touching it, enough to move without confidence and without fear. This reduction did not feel like loss. It felt like accuracy. When light is excessive, it creates expectations. It suggests that something is meant to be seen. When light becomes modest, it removes that suggestion. Nothing here needed to be displayed. Nothing asked to be revealed. The city had no secrets left that required protection, and no features that demanded admiration. Darkness filled the rest without resistance. These darker areas did not hide anything. They simply existed beyond necessity. In busy places, darkness often feels incomplete. It seems like something is missing or withheld. Here, darkness felt resolved. It occupied space that light no longer needed and did so politely. Shadows became stable. They did not shift dramatically with passing crowds or moving torches. They settled into consistent shapes night after night. This consistency mattered. When shadows stop moving unpredictably, the body relaxes. There is no need to track motion. Nothing is approaching. Light no longer created hierarchy. No part of the space was emphasized over another. The city became evenly visible and evenly obscure. This balance was comforting. Without focal points, the mind did not linger. It observed and moved on. There is a subtle irony in how much effort once went into illumination. Complex systems were built to make sure nothing went unseen. Now the absence of those systems made the city easier to read. Less light meant fewer distractions, fewer reflections, fewer false signals. The ground appeared when necessary and disappeared when not. Walls announced themselves just in time. Edges softened without vanishing. Light behaved like a companion rather than a guide. It walked beside movement instead of pulling it forward. In this environment, darkness stopped feeling dramatic. It became practical. It filled the space between useful light without commentary. The night did not conceal danger because there was little left to threaten. It did not reveal beauty because beauty no longer required confirmation. The city had learned that visibility is not the same as understanding. In its quieter state, it preferred clarity over exposure, enough light to move and no more. Anything beyond that was unnecessary labor. People passing through adapted without noticing. Their steps slowed slightly. Their eyes adjusted. There was no urgency to identify landmarks. The city no longer asked to be navigated with precision. It allowed approximation. This made movement gentler. When light does not rush you, you stop rushing yourself. Paths were followed instinctively. Familiar shadows signaled direction more reliably than signs ever had. Buildings responded to this change without modification. Surfaces reflected less. Stone absorbed what little light touched it. Materials appeared older but also calmer. Without glare, textures softened. Details existed for those who happened to notice them but did not insist. The absence of dramatic lighting removed performance. Architecture no longer staged itself for appreciation. It simply occupied space with dignity. A column was a column. A wall was a wall. Nothing asked to be interpreted beyond its physical presence. There is comfort in that reduction. The night did not attempt to make the city impressive. It allowed it to be legible. Legibility is underrated. It does not overwhelm. It reassures. Darkness here felt trustworthy. It behaved consistently. It did not surprise. It did not shift unexpectedly. Once the eyes adjusted, everything remained exactly where it had been moments before. This reliability extended into time. Night after night, the pattern repeated. Light appeared where movement required it. Darkness reclaimed the rest. Nothing escalated. Nothing faded dramatically. The city settled into a rhythm that required no attention to maintain. It is worth noting how little effort this took. No one coordinated it, no authority enforced it. The city arrived here naturally once it no longer needed to impress anyone. Light learned humility. That humility created space for rest. Without excessive illumination, the mind stopped scanning. It stopped searching for meaning in brightness. It accepted the environment as complete. The city no longer tried to explain itself through visibility. It trusted that those who needed to move would see enough. Those who did not could remain still without consequence. This is how darkness becomes safe. Not by revealing everything, but by behaving predictably. Not by hiding, but by being honest about what matters. Nothing dramatic occurred under this light. No events demanded attention. No moments insisted on memory. The night passed as it always did, quietly, efficiently. As hours moved forward, illumination remained consistent. No sudden changes, no surprises. The city rested in partial visibility without tension. This was not neglect. It was completion. After sound found its place and light found its limit, the night achieved balance. Nothing competed. Nothing insisted. The city existed within its own boundaries comfortably. Movement slowed naturally. The body responded to the absence of stimulation. Eyes adjusted. Breathing followed. The environment did not need to assist sleep. It simply stopped interfering with it. The city no longer tried to be seen. It allowed itself to be passed through gently or not at all. And in that restraint, the night became whole. Those who stayed when history lost interest, they were never meant to be remembered. That was not a tragedy. It was simply how their lives aligned with the place. When attention withdrew from the city and monuments stopped organizing movement, some people remained without explanation, not as guardians of memory and not as symbols of continuity. They stayed because staying required less effort than leaving. These were not characters shaped by history. They did not feel the need to explain where they lived or why. They did not rehearse stories for visitors who no longer came. Their presence had no narrative ambition. They lived near the old structures because their houses were there, because the ground still supported walls, because moving elsewhere would have required resources that offered no clear improvement. The city adjusted around them without asking for their opinion. Streets became quieter, paths became less intentional, space widened without needing to accommodate crowds. The people who stayed adapted instinctively. When noise recedes, behavior simplifies. Voices lower without instruction. Movements become direct. No one performs for an audience that does not exist. Some of them walked past the old stones daily, not with reverence and not with boredom, just with familiarity. The structures were part of the environment in the same way uneven ground or changing light was, not obstacles and not destinations, just features to navigate without thinking. There is a subtle irony in that arrangement. Entire generations once traveled great distances to stand where these people stood without noticing. Now those same places were crossed while carrying water or returning home at night. Significance had drained away, leaving usability behind. And usability was enough. These people did not tell stories about the past because stories require listeners. Without listeners, memory becomes private, and private memory does not seek structure. What happened here long ago was no longer relevant to daily decisions. Where to step mattered more than where others once stood. Some might have known fragments of the past, names without context, events without consequence. Knowledge like that tends to fade when it does not affect the present. Memory competes poorly with routine. Routine wins quietly. There were those who watched over the area at night, not as custodians of meaning, but as individuals whose job required awareness. They listened for movement. They noticed changes in sound. Their attention was practical. A sound out of place mattered more than the history beneath their feet. These watchers did not feel important. Importance would have complicated their work. They were there to notice and move on, to observe without interpreting. The stones did not ask for protection, and they did not offer instruction. The relationship was neutral and effective. Others lived close enough that the old structures framed their evenings. Children passed by without learning names. Adults adjusted roots around collapsed edges without commentary. Life threaded itself through the remains with minimal friction. The city did not romanticize them, and they did not romanticize the city. That balance allowed both to persist without conflict. The people did not expect the place to provide meaning. The place did not expect the people to remember anything. This kind of coexistence is rare, but stable. When expectations vanish, frustration follows them. Nothing needs to be proven. Nothing needs to be preserved beyond what is already there. There is mild humor in how thoroughly unremarkable this arrangement is. Grand structures once demanded attention and now serve as reference points for turning corners. Lives continue beside them without ceremony. The monumental becomes mundane and no one feels cheated. The people who remained were not heroic. They were not resistant. They were simply aligned with the practical reality of the place. Leaving would not have improved their lives enough to justify the effort. Staying did not require explanation. At night, their presence blended into the city without sound. Footsteps remained isolated. Doors closed softly. Conversations ended early. The environment encouraged rest without instruction. No one needed to coordinate quiet. Quiet emerged naturally. These people did not see themselves as the last of anything. That perspective belongs to outsiders. From within, life felt continuous. Yesterday resembled today closely enough to avoid reflection. They woke and slept without thinking about the city as a concept. It was not a destination or a symbol. It was simply where things happened, where meals were prepared, where paths were followed, where days ended. History often prefers moments of departure. It records who left and why. It struggles to account for those who stayed because staying does not announce itself. It produces no dates and no declarations. It just continues. The people near the old structures did not interrupt the silence. They fit within it. Their routines did not compete with the environment. They adapted to its rhythm rather than reshaping it. This made the city easier to inhabit. Without competing purposes, space became cooperative. The ground held weight. Walls marked boundaries. The past did not interfere. It is tempting to imagine these people as witnesses to history. In reality, they were witnesses to weather and time. They noticed practical changes, a surface becoming smoother, a path becoming less reliable. These observations mattered more than anything recorded. The absence of historical consciousness did not make their lives smaller. It made them efficient. Energy was spent on what mattered immediately: food, shelter, rest. The stones were part of that equation only insofar as they occupied space. And so the city continued. Not because it was remembered, but because it was inhabited. The people who stayed did not preserve history. They outlasted it. When attention disappears, what remains reveals itself honestly. In this case, what remained were lives uninterested in significance. And that lack of interest allowed the place to settle into something stable. The city no longer needed to explain itself to anyone. Neither did the people who lived within it. Together they formed a quiet agreement. Stay because it works. Leave nothing to justify. That agreement held. And in holding, it allowed the night to remain calm, deep, and entirely unconcerned with being remembered. Familiarity completed what indifference had begun. After those who stayed stopped noticing the weight of the past, the stones themselves adjusted. Not physically and not symbolically. They adjusted by becoming ordinary. What was once remarkable through repetition lost its ability to interrupt thought. The old surfaces settled into the background the way furniture does in a room that has been lived in too long to admire. Stone performs this transition quietly. It does not announce that it has stopped being important. It simply allows the eye to pass over it without stopping. Color dulls slightly, edges soften. The mind registers presence without attaching significance. This is not neglect. It is normalization. People living nearby no longer oriented themselves around the remains. They did not avoid them, and they did not approach them with care. They walked past them as they would any wall or slope. Their bodies learned the terrain without conscious acknowledgement. Familiar roots replaced historical awareness. At this stage, the ruins stopped being ruins. That word implies interruption. What remained was continuity. The stones existed as part of the environment rather than as evidence of something else. They no longer pointed backward, they simply occupied space. This familiarity stripped the site of drama. No one paused to consider loss. Loss requires comparison, and comparison requires memory. Memory had become unnecessary. The present had proven sufficient on its own. Children growing up near the stones did not inherit awe. Awe is learned, and there was no one left to teach it. The remains were not framed as special, they were framed as there. Children climbed where it was safe. They avoided where it was not. The stones taught caution rather than reverence. Adults behaved similarly. They navigated around collapsed sections without reflection. They noticed changes only when those changes affected movement. A surface becoming unstable mattered. A column leaning slightly more than before mattered. The reason those things existed did not. This is how long duration alters perception. When something lasts long enough without demanding attention, it loses its claim on importance. Importance requires urgency. Urgency had left long ago. The irony is gentle. Structures built to command attention now excelled at being ignored. Their survival depended not on admiration but on irrelevance. No one felt compelled to remove them. No one felt obligated to protect them beyond basic safety. They were too familiar to provoke action. In this way, the stones found a stable position within the city, not central and not absent, just present. That presence did not burden anyone. It did not invite discussion. It did not require maintenance beyond what naturally occurred. Time interacted differently with familiar objects. Without observation, change appeared slower. Weather continued its work, but without witnesses it felt less dramatic. A crack widened, a surface eroded. These changes happened gradually enough to avoid comment. Night reinforced this neutrality. Darkness did not distinguish old stone from newer walls. Everything blended into a consistent texture of shadow and limited visibility. The ruins lost even their visual distinction. They became part of the general shape of the place. This uniformity was calming. When nothing stands out, the mind relaxes. There is no need to prioritize, no need to remember. The environment becomes predictable. Predictability is often mistaken for boredom. In reality, it is comfort. The people who stayed understood this without articulation. Their routines integrated seamlessly with the environment. They adjusted their steps. They adapted paths. The stones were neither obstacles nor landmarks. They were simply features. At some point, the idea that these remains had once been different faded entirely. Without stories to sustain contrast, the past lost its outline. What had been built and why no longer mattered. Only what remained usable mattered. This did not diminish the city. It streamlined it. Energy was no longer spent on interpretation. The place required no explanation. It functioned without narrative. Visitors who passed through occasionally sensed this shift without understanding it. They expected significance and found none being offered. The ruins did not perform for them. The locals did not guide them. The environment did not confirm their expectations. Some visitors felt unsettled by this. They mistook neutrality for emptiness. Others found it reassuring. There is relief in encountering a place that does not ask anything of you. For those who lived there, this condition was ideal. The absence of imposed meaning allowed life to continue at a manageable scale. Work happened, rest followed. Days passed without needing to be distinguished from one another. The stones supported this rhythm by remaining consistent. They did not change suddenly. They did not demand adaptation beyond what had already been learned. Familiarity made the environment cooperative. There is subtle humor in imagining how much effort had once gone into making these structures impressive. That effort had succeeded so thoroughly that it had exhausted itself. What remained was material doing what material does best, enduring quietly. The city did not mourn the loss of significance. Mourning requires attachment. Attachment had been replaced by habit. Habit is resilient. It does not depend on memory. Over time, even the concept of ruins lost relevance. The stones were no longer contrasted with what they used to be. They simply were. The city adjusted its expectations accordingly. In this state, nothing needed to be preserved deliberately. The environment maintained itself through use and avoidance. Paths formed where movement occurred. Other areas remained untouched. This natural order proved sufficient. Silence thrived here not because sound was forbidden, but because nothing needed to be announced. Familiarity removed urgency. Without urgency, volume decreased. Without volume, the night felt deeper. The stones did not witness this change. Witnessing implies awareness. They simply remained. The people adapted. That adaptation completed the transition from history to background. Once something becomes background, it stops competing with the present. It allows the present to unfold without interference. The stones near the old center achieved this quietly. They no longer represented loss or grandeur. They represented continuity. Not continuity of meaning, but continuity of presence. This presence allowed the city to rest. Without the weight of remembrance, the place became lighter, easier to move through, easier to inhabit. And so familiarity settled fully. The stones became part of the night in the same way air and ground were part of it, unremarkable, reliable, entirely unconcerned with being noticed. In that condition, the city found stability, not through memory, but through repetition, not through significance, but through use. The ruins no longer interrupted life. They supported it simply by staying where they were. And that was enough. From center to margin without announcement. The change did not arrive with sound. No marker was placed. No route was closed with ceremony. The space simply shifted position in the city's daily logic. What had once pulled movement toward itself now sat slightly aside, still visible, still solid, but no longer essential. The map changed without anyone bothering to redraw it. This is how places lose their central role, not through destruction and not through rejection, but through rerouting. People began taking other paths because those paths were shorter, flatter, more practical. Over time, the old route remained intact, but unused. The space did not move. The city moved around it. At first, the difference was subtle, a few fewer footsteps, a little more dust settling without being disturbed. The space still assumed it mattered, at least structurally. Its proportions suggested importance. Its layout implied arrival. But implication requires confirmation, and confirmation stopped coming. Cities are efficient when left alone. They reduce friction wherever possible. If a space no longer contributes to daily efficiency, it becomes optional. Optional spaces are not abandoned. They are bypassed. And being bypassed is quieter than being removed. Once a place slips off the main route, attention follows quickly. Sounds thin out. The background noise of daily life redirects itself elsewhere. What remains is not silence exactly, but absence of urgency. Nothing needs to pass through here unless it chooses to. This shift does not offend the space. Stone does not feel neglected. Architecture does not experience disappointment. Those reactions belong to people. The built environment simply adjusts to a different volume of interaction. There is a faint irony in how quickly centrality fades. Enormous effort once went into ensuring this space could not be ignored. Routes were aligned, sight lines were considered, everything pointed inward. Once the pointing stopped being reinforced, it lost authority. The space did not protest, it waited. Waiting is something old structures are very good at. People walking nearby no longer oriented themselves toward it. They stopped using it as a reference point. Directions changed. Turn left at the market instead. Follow the flatter road. Avoid the uneven ground. The old center remained where it was, but no longer organized thought. This is when a symbol becomes scenery. Scenery does not demand interaction. It frames movement without shaping it. The space continued to exist visually, but it stopped influencing behavior. And behavior is the only thing that gives places power. At night, this transition became clearer. Without traffic or regular passage, the space lost its rhythm. No predictable footsteps. No repeated sounds. The ground cooled evenly. Air moved without interruption. The space did not fill. It rested. Resting spaces feel different. They are not tense. They do not anticipate arrival. They do not prepare for use. They exist in a finished state as though their work is complete. The city did not mark this change because there was nothing to mark. No law declared the space marginal. No decision was announced. The shift happened through thousands of small choices made by people who did not consider themselves part of a pattern. This makes the margin difficult to notice while it is forming. By the time it becomes obvious, it is already stabilized. Once a space reaches the margin, it stops competing. Competition belongs to centers. Margins accept their role quietly. They do not need to prove relevance. They simply remain available. Availability is underrated. It allows presence without demand. People can pass through without obligation, or not pass through at all. Either option is acceptable. The old space began to collect this kind of availability. Those who entered did so by choice, not necessity. They slowed down, not because the space required reverence, but because nothing hurried them forward. There is gentle humor in watching a former center adapt to this role. What once needed constant management now required almost none. No scheduling, no crowd control, no maintenance driven by visibility. The space became low effort. Low effort spaces endure. The city benefited as well. With pressure removed, surrounding routes functioned more smoothly. Flow redistributed itself naturally. The margin absorbed nothing and demanded nothing. It simply existed as excess capacity. At this point, the idea of importance lost clarity. What does it mean for a place to matter if no one needs it to? The space still mattered structurally. It still occupied land. It still shaped wind and shadow. But it no longer mattered socially. Social mattering is temporary. Structural presence is not. The margin did not feel empty. It felt resolved. There was no sense of something missing. Only the sense that nothing needed to happen here anymore. People who lived nearby adjusted their expectations. They did not speak of decline. Decline implies loss. This felt more like release. The space was no longer burdened with responsibility. Children passed through without instruction. Adults avoided it when efficiency mattered and entered it when they wanted quiet. The margin served its new role without guidance. Night reinforced this identity. Darkness treated the space evenly. Without lighting designed to attract, the area blended seamlessly into its surroundings. It did not stand out. It did not disappear. It settled. This is where many old symbols end up. Not erased and not preserved with care. simply repositioned from center to margin without announcement. The transition was complete when no one noticed it anymore. By then, the space no longer needed to be explained. It did not symbolize anything. It did not represent loss or greatness. It represented continuity in a reduced form. And that reduction was not a failure. It was adaptation. The city continued. Routes remained efficient. Life moved where it needed to move. The margin held still and allowed that movement to happen elsewhere. In doing so, it found a quiet stability, free from expectation, free from performance. A former center does not vanish when it becomes a margin. It changes posture. It stops reaching outward and settles inward. That settling is calm, deep, slightly unsettling only because it reveals how easily importance relocates. The space learned this without resistance. It stayed where it was and let the city pass it by. And that was enough. Utility arrived quietly, as it usually does, after meaning finished its work and stepped aside without asking to be thanked. Once the space had settled into the margin, its value stopped being discussed and started being tested. Not in speeches and not in plans, but in small daily decisions that never recorded themselves anywhere. What could still be used stayed. What could not was ignored without regret. Some stones found new purposes without being asked. A low wall became a place to sit because it was at the right height. A wide slab offered shade at certain hours, and so it was returned to again and again. A fallen block redirected foot traffic slightly, and that redirection proved convenient enough to keep. None of this involved intention. Use does not announce itself. It simply repeats until it becomes normal. Other parts were left entirely alone, not preserved and not destroyed, just present without function. These areas did not invite interaction, and so they received none. No one felt obligated to decide their fate. Decision requires urgency, and urgency had already left the area. Absence became the default condition, and the city accepted it. There was no debate about this shift. Debate belongs to moments when something still matters symbolically. Here, symbolism had already thinned out. Practicality took its place without ceremony. People used what helped them and stepped around what did not. That was the extent of the policy. It is tempting to imagine conflict in moments like this, competing ideas, disagreements over value. But the truth was less dramatic. Choices were made quietly and consistently. A path worn into the ground said more than any argument could. Feet decide faster than minds. The city did not mourn the loss of meaning. Meaning had already finished dissolving. What remained was material, and material invites assessment. Is it stable? Is it in the way? Does it shelter? Does it complicate movement? If the answer was no to all of these, the material remained untouched. Neutral objects are difficult to oppose. Utility does not seek to replace meaning. It simply arrives after meaning leaves. It operates on different rules. It does not care what something used to represent. It only cares what it does now. This made the environment simpler. Without the pressure to honor the past, the present could function efficiently. The space stopped being a question and became an answer to very small needs. Shade, support, boundaries, direction. Nothing more ambitious than that. Some structures adapted better than others. Broad surfaces aged into seating naturally. Narrow passages became shortcuts. Solid blocks turned into barriers that guided movement without instruction. The environment reorganized itself according to use rather than design. Other elements failed this test quietly. They remained unused not because they were forbidden, but because they offered nothing useful. These were not eyesores, they were just irrelevant. Irrelevance does not attract hostility. It attracts indifference. Indifference proved sustainable. The city around the margin learned this lesson quickly. Maintenance followed use rather than appearance. Areas that supported daily movement stayed relatively clear. Others collected dust and shadow. No one tried to balance this distribution. Balance implies intention. This was simply outcome. Night made these distinctions clearer. Useful areas retained occasional movement even after dark. A familiar bench still received someone sitting briefly. A reliable path still carried footsteps. Unused spaces grew quieter and darker without resistance. There was no effort to light what no one needed to see. Illumination followed function the same way attention did, enough to move safely, not enough to display. Light learned to respect utility. This was not decay. It was efficiency after ambition. The humor in this shift was subtle but persistent. Structures that once demanded reverence now served as background conveniences. The dramatic had become practical without protest. It turned out that stone did not mind being useful more than being admired. Those who lived nearby understood this intuitively. They did not frame their interactions as adaptation. They simply responded to what worked. If a surface was comfortable, it was used. If a route was reliable, it was followed. If something offered nothing, it was left alone. This kind of reasoning requires no explanation. It produces no records, it leaves no trace beyond wear patterns and habits. Histories struggle with these moments because they lack narrative tension. Nothing is gained and nothing is lost in a way that can be dramatized. But life improved slightly. Without the obligation to interpret space, movement became easier. Decisions required less thought. The environment no longer asked for respect or understanding. It asked only for navigation. This shift reduced friction. When meaning leaves, conflict often follows in its absence. Here, conflict never arrived. Utility filled the space immediately. There was nothing left to argue about. The margin became cooperative. It did not interfere with daily life, and daily life did not interfere with it. That mutual indifference created stability. Stability has its own quiet appeal. It does not promise improvement. It promises continuity. For many people, that is enough. The stones that were reused did not gain new significance. They gained wear, smoothness, familiarity. These qualities matter more in daily life than symbolism ever could. A comfortable surface is remembered longer than a meaningful one. Those stones that remained unused also served a purpose of sorts. They defined limits. They held space open. They reminded the city where it did not need to go. Absence of use can be informative when it remains consistent. Over time, the distinction between reused and untouched became part of the landscape. No one pointed it out. Everyone navigated it. The city did not feel smaller because of this. It felt more manageable. Without the weight of past meaning, the environment became easier to inhabit. There was less to consider, less to protect, less to explain. Night settled into this arrangement naturally. Darkness respected use just as light did. Useful areas remained faintly visible. Others faded into shadow completely. The city did not resist this hierarchy. It accepted it as practical. This is how spaces survive long after interest fades. Not through preservation and not through neglect, but through selective usefulness. What works remains. What does not becomes invisible without being removed. There is a certain calm in that process. No declarations, no restorations, no campaigns, just quiet alignment between material and need. The margin had completed its transformation, from center to background, and now from meaning to utility. The final stage was not dramatic. It was restful. Nothing here asked to be remembered. Nothing asked to be interpreted. Everything existed at the scale of daily life. The stones stayed because they were not in the way. Some were touched, some were not. That distinction held without enforcement. The city moved on around them and within them, guided not by memory but by convenience. And convenience, it turned out, was far more enduring than meaning ever was, a decline that never learned how to end. There was no final night. That is the detail most people search for and fail to find. No evening where the city went quiet all at once. No dramatic moment when something important stopped happening. The decline did not announce itself because it did not consider itself an event. It behaved more like a habit slowly forgotten than a structure collapsing. Things simply happened less often. Footsteps passed through the space with increasing gaps between them. Voices lowered not because silence was demanded, but because there were fewer reasons to speak loudly. Lamps were lit for shorter stretches of time because fewer people needed them. None of this felt decisive. Each change was small enough to ignore. At first, people assumed the quiet was temporary. Cities are familiar with fluctuations. Crowds come and go. Activity concentrates and disperses. A quieter season does not automatically suggest an ending. So the city waited. It had learned patience long before. It learned ambition. The waiting stretched. What did not return was not mourned. Mourning requires contrast, and contrast requires memory. But memory blurs when change arrives gradually. No one noticed a specific absence because nothing disappeared all at once. Everything simply became less frequent. There were no barricades, no closed gates, no signs explaining that something had ended. Roads remained open. Spaces remained accessible. The city did not withdraw its invitation. It just stopped being accepted as often. This kind of decline is difficult to describe because it does not provide landmarks. Histories prefer moments they can underline. This offered none. The decline had no posture. It did not stand up. It lay down slowly and rested. Buildings continued to function at reduced intensity. Structures that once supported constant movement learned how to hold still. They did not break under the absence of pressure. They relaxed. The city did not collapse into silence. Silence crept in as sound withdrew. That distinction matters. Silence imposed feels tense. Silence accumulated feels natural. Here, the quiet felt earned through repetition. Even those who remained nearby did not feel as though they were witnessing an ending. Life continued. Work still happened. Paths were still followed. The difference was subtle enough to feel normal. This is where irony appears gently. A place once designed to handle attention proved equally capable of surviving neglect. The absence of crowds did not damage its structure. If anything, it reduced wear. The city had expected catastrophe at some point, or perhaps people did. A moment when something broke, when a wall fell, when a decision was made. That moment never arrived. Instead, usefulness thinned gradually until it reached a level that required no explanation. Spaces that once felt crowded now felt spacious. Spaciousness is often mistaken for loss. In this case, it was simply excess capacity revealing itself. The decline did not interrupt daily life because daily life had already adjusted. Fewer transactions required fewer interactions. Fewer interactions required less coordination. The city became simpler without anyone planning for it. Night revealed this most clearly. Without scheduled activity, darkness settled evenly. There were no peaks of noise to recede from, no bursts of light to fade. The city entered night smoothly, as if it had been practicing for years. Because it had, there was no sense of disappointment. Disappointment requires expectation. Expectations had quietly expired. The city no longer expected to be busy. That expectation had dissolved long before anyone noticed its absence. Some structures waited for a purpose that never returned. Others were repurposed without ceremony. None resisted the change. Resistance implies awareness. Stone does not resist absence. It adapts by remaining. This made the decline unusually calm. No one felt compelled to intervene. No emergency demanded response. The city did not fail in a way that required repair. It simply stopped being necessary at the scale it once occupied. The lack of climax unsettles those who prefer resolution. There is comfort in endings that announce themselves. This offered none. The city did not give permission to move on. It simply became something that did not require attention. People passing through sensed this without naming it. They did not linger, not out of disrespect, but because there was nothing calling them to stop. The place no longer projected urgency or significance. It did not pull. This absence of pull is important. Places lose power when they stop influencing movement. Influence does not vanish dramatically. It erodes, step by step, choice by choice, until routes reorganize themselves naturally. Once routes change, attention follows. And once attention leaves, memory becomes optional. The decline completed itself not with silence, but with neutrality. The city reached a state where nothing needed to be explained. It existed without context. That is a rare condition. At this stage, decline is no longer a process. It is a condition. Stable, manageable, unspectacular. There was no generation that could say it witnessed the end. Each generation inherited a version of the city that already felt settled. Nothing appeared unfinished. Nothing appeared broken. The absence of climax made the result feel permanent. This permanence did not inspire nostalgia. Nostalgia depends on loss that can be identified. Here, loss was distributed too evenly to be located. No one could point to what had gone missing because nothing had vanished outright. Instead, the city arrived at a quieter equilibrium, one that required less energy, less explanation, less effort. The irony is subtle but persistent. The lack of drama allowed the place to continue. A dramatic collapse might have invited intervention or removal. Gradual fading did not. The city slipped beneath the threshold of concern. And so it remained. The decline that never learned how to end proved more effective than any decisive conclusion. It avoided attention. It avoided rescue. It avoided correction. It simply became the background. At night, this background feels complete. There is no tension, no expectation of change. The environment does not wait for morning with urgency. It knows morning will arrive whether or not anything happens. This is what a decline without climax looks like. Not an ending, but a settling. Not disappearance, but repositioning. The city did not vanish. It stopped insisting. And that quiet insistence on remaining without explanation or conclusion turned out to be the most enduring outcome of all. What followed was not emptiness but invisibility. After decline stopped trying to finish, familiarity took over completely. The place did not feel abandoned. It felt unnoticed. That distinction mattered. Abandonment suggests loss, and loss suggests memory. Invisibility requires neither. It happens when something remains present long enough to stop being registered at all. The streets did not change shape. The stones did not shift position. The air did not behave differently. What changed was attention. Attention thinned until it no longer landed here by default. People walked through without recording the experience. Their bodies navigated the space while their minds moved elsewhere. That is how places begin to disappear without leaving. Nothing here felt new enough to deserve inspection. Nothing felt broken enough to require concern. The environment had reached a stable level of normal. Normal is the most efficient way for something to fade. When something becomes ordinary, it stops competing for awareness. This was not a sudden condition. It took time. Repetition wore down distinction. Each night resembled the last, closely enough to erase contrast. Without contrast, memory loses traction. There was nothing to recall because nothing stood out. The city learned this rhythm well. It repeated itself with such consistency that even small changes felt irrelevant. A stone shifting slightly, a shadow lengthening earlier in the evening. These details did not accumulate into meaning. They passed through awareness and dissolved. The places that had once been described carefully no longer required description. Describing something implies that it differs from expectation. Here, expectation had adjusted. The environment behaved exactly as predicted. Predictability removes curiosity. There is a quiet irony in how thorough this transformation was. So much effort had once been invested in making the place unforgettable. Now it excelled at the opposite. It did not resist being overlooked. It cooperated with it. People nearby did not speak about the site because speaking would have suggested significance. There was no social advantage in mentioning something everyone already knew how to ignore. Silence became a shared agreement, not enforced, simply understood. Children grew up without learning which stones were old and which were newer. That distinction did not matter to them. The ground was the ground. Walls were walls. Roots existed to be followed, not interpreted. Familiarity removed the need for explanation. Adults behaved similarly. They navigated the environment with efficiency rather than reflection. Their bodies remembered uneven surfaces better than their minds remembered history. Memory became practical. Where not to step, where the path narrowed, where light faded earlier. This kind of memory does not preserve stories. It preserves movement. The place had become functional in a different way. Not useful in the sense of providing resources or shelter, but useful as background. Background is essential. It supports attention elsewhere. It allows focus without distraction. Invisibility is often mistaken for absence. Here, nothing was absent. Everything remained exactly where it had been. But remaining is not enough to be seen. Visibility requires difference. And difference had been worn smooth. Night amplified this effect. Darkness flattened detail. Without lighting designed to emphasize, surfaces blended together. The eye passed over forms without stopping. Nothing asked to be identified. The environment offered no puzzles. This made the night feel deeper, not because it concealed, but because it simplified. When nothing stands out, depth increases. The mind relaxes into the uniformity. There is nothing to solve. Even sound followed this pattern. Familiar noises faded into expectation. A breeze sounded like it always had. A distant step registered and disappeared. Nothing lingered long enough to be noticed twice. The city had not become empty. It had become background noise for itself. Life continued within it, but without commentary. People moved, doors closed, nights passed. None of it demanded attention. This state is difficult to reverse. Once something becomes invisible, restoring its visibility requires disruption. Disruption introduces friction. Friction invites reaction. No one here was interested in reacting. The absence of reaction protected the place. Without attention, it avoided interference. Without interference, it remained stable. Stability reinforced familiarity. Familiarity deepened invisibility. The cycle sustained itself quietly. Visitors passing through sometimes felt unsettled without knowing why. They expected a reaction from the environment. Some cue that this place mattered. They found none. The absence of instruction left them unsure where to look. Without guidance, they moved on. Those who lived there did not notice this discomfort. They had long since stopped expecting the place to explain itself. Explanation had become unnecessary. Everything worked well enough. There is mild humor in imagining how loudly this place had once spoken. Now it whispered so softly it barely registered. The contrast would have been amusing if anyone had paused to compare. No one did. Invisibility does not mean nothing happens. It means what happens does not accumulate into story. Events dissolve into routine before they can be remembered. Time passes without punctuation. This is why there was no nostalgia. Nostalgia requires a clear before and after. Here, before and after overlapped until they were indistinguishable. The past did not feel lost. It felt irrelevant. Irrelevance is gentle. It does not wound. It does not provoke defense. It allows things to remain without explanation. The city accepted this condition fully. It no longer needed to assert itself. It had become an environment rather than a subject. An environment supports. A subject demands attention. The shift was complete. Night after night, the place behaved exactly as expected. Darkness arrived. Sounds softened. Movement slowed. Nothing changed enough to be recorded. This is how something becomes invisible without disappearing. It stays in place long enough for the mind to stop seeing it. The decline that never learned how to end now reached its quiet conclusion. Not an ending marked by absence, but a settling into familiarity so deep, it erased itself from notice. What was once special became normal. Normal lasted long enough to become unseen. And unseen, the place found its most stable form. It no longer needed to be remembered to exist. It existed because it was there. That was sufficient. The night accepted this without comment. It spread evenly. It did not search for landmarks. It treated everything the same. In that sameness, the city rested. Nothing asked to be recalled. Nothing asked to be saved. Nothing asked to be explained. The place remained. Calm. Deep. Slightly unsettling only because it revealed how easily attention lets go. And in letting go, it allowed the night to continue uninterrupted. When history stops trying to impress, history sometimes grows tired, not tired in a dramatic way and not tired enough to collapse, just tired enough to stop performing. This is the state the city entered late at night when nothing remained to be proven. No stories were told because stories require listeners. No lessons were offered because lessons assume urgency. What remained was presence without intention. In this hour, history does not advance. It does not retreat either. It rests. Rest here does not mean recovery. It means suspension. A pause long enough that movement loses direction. Time continues, but without emphasis. Minutes pass without asking to be counted. The city accepts this easily. Stones do not need motivation. Streets do not require meaning. They hold their shape and allow hours to move across them without comment. Nothing tries to explain itself. Nothing competes for relevance. This is not the history people search for. There are no turning points here. No decisions. No figures stepping forward. The absence of action is complete enough to feel deliberate, even though it is not. That quiet can feel unsettling because it refuses to cooperate with expectation. We are trained to expect history to speak, to announce causes and outcomes, to arrange itself into something useful. In this state, it does none of that. It simply exists. The city does not narrate its past. It does not summarize. It does not prepare for reflection. There is a subtle irony in this refusal. Entire systems once existed to ensure this place would never be ignored. Structures were positioned carefully. Movement was directed. Attention was engineered. Now none of that matters. The environment functions perfectly well without witnesses. At night, this becomes clearer. Without daylight encouraging interpretation, the city sheds even the illusion of significance. Shapes soften, edges retreat. The mind stops trying to assign meaning because nothing invites it. This is not emptiness, it is fullness without intention. Everything is present, but nothing is active. The ground remains firm. The air remains still enough to notice. Sound exists, but does not accumulate. Footsteps appear occasionally and vanish again without consequence. They do not build toward anything. They do not leave traces. The city absorbs them the way it absorbs wind, without reaction. History in this state is not absent. It is inactive. It has stopped asserting itself. That can feel uncomfortable to those who expect history to behave like a guide. Here it behaves like a surface, neutral, reliable, uninterested. The people who remain nearby do not notice this shift because they have nothing to compare it to. This has become normal. When normal lasts long enough, it stops being perceived as a condition. It simply becomes the way things are. No one asks what this place means anymore. Asking would imply that meaning is required. The city has learned that it can exist without explanation. That realization removes pressure. Without pressure, things settle. There is a quiet humor in how complete this settling is. Once there were arguments about importance, about memory, about preservation. Now none of that energy remains. The city has outlasted debate by becoming irrelevant to it. This irrelevance is not failure, it is efficiency. A place that no longer demands attention uses less of it. A place that no longer competes rests more easily. At this hour, history stops organizing itself into stories. It stops offering warnings. It stops suggesting parallels. The past does not comment on the present. It does not need to. The present has learned how to move on its own. The absence of instruction can feel disorienting. Without narrative cues, the mind has nothing to hold. That is the unsettling part. Not danger, just openness. This openness allows rest. When nothing is being asked of you, you stop preparing answers. The city no longer tests memory. It does not check awareness. It allows the night to continue without interference. History at rest does not announce its rest. It does not dim lights or close doors. It simply ceases to act, like a machine left running but no longer producing output. The irony is that this state is remarkably stable. Without movement, there is less friction. Without friction, there is less damage. The city preserves itself by not insisting on relevance. This is why nothing dramatic happens here. Drama requires stakes. Stakes require investment. Investment has already moved elsewhere. The city does not mind. It has learned that being unnoticed is sustainable. Being admired is exhausting. As the night deepens, the sense of suspension becomes complete. Time feels thicker, not slower, just less segmented. Hours pass without punctuation. No one marks this passage. No bells, no announcements, no rituals. The city does not acknowledge the hour. It treats all hours the same. This is the moment when history feels closest to geology. Layers exist. Pressure exists. But nothing is being rearranged quickly enough to matter. The unsettling part is realizing how comfortable this feels. How little is required for continuity. How easily meaning can withdraw without leaving a void. We often imagine history as something that moves relentlessly. In truth, it pauses more often than it advances. Those pauses are simply less visible. Here the pause has extended long enough to become a condition, a quiet plateau where nothing needs to happen for things to continue. The city rests in this plateau without tension. It does not wait for revival. It does not anticipate loss. It simply remains. This is history without ambition, without audience, without agenda, just presence. The night holds this presence gently. It does not disturb it. It does not ask it to perform. In this state, the city is not teaching and not remembering. It is existing. And that existence does not require attention. It requires only time. Time continues, nothing changes. That is the point. Time did not argue with the city after it stopped trying to impress. It did not arrive with tools or announcements. It arrived with adjustment. Expectations lowered quietly, not lowered enough to feel like loss, just enough to feel manageable. What once needed to overwhelm now only needed to remain. The structure that had been designed to command attention discovered a secondary talent. It blocked wind efficiently. Its walls interrupted air movement just enough to make standing nearby more comfortable. This was not its original purpose, but time is not interested in original purposes. Time is interested in outcomes that require no further explanation. There is a particular irony in that transition. The effort required to astonish had been enormous. The effort required to shelter was minimal. Time favored the minimal. It always does. Anything that demands ongoing admiration eventually becomes tiring. Anything that quietly improves comfort tends to stay. No one announced this change. People simply stood in certain spots more often. They paused where the wind softened. They leaned where stone absorbed the chill. Use replaced meaning without discussion. No one felt the need to justify this behavior. Comfort rarely requires justification. The city accepted this new role for the structure without resistance. Acceptance is easier when nothing is being taken away. The building still existed. It still occupied space. It simply stopped being asked to perform beyond what it could do effortlessly. This is how time reframes ambition, not by destroying it, but by demoting it. Grandeur is expensive to maintain. Utility is not. Time has always preferred the economical option. The night made this adjustment obvious. Without daylight to flatter surfaces, the structure stopped advertising itself. It blended into the environment. What remained noticeable was not scale or design, but effect. Less wind, slight warmth, a place to pause without explanation. This did not feel like disappointment. Disappointment would imply that someone expected more. Expectations had already been corrected. The city no longer asked to be impressed. It asked to be livable. Time did not remove complexity all at once. It reduced it gradually. Details that once demanded attention became optional. Decorations faded into texture. Proportions lost their authority. What mattered was whether a surface held or shifted, whether it cut the wind or redirected it. These are quiet questions. They do not invite debate. They answer themselves through repetition. People return to the same sheltered spot because it worked yesterday. That was reason enough. The structure did not object to this reduction. Stone does not resist being useful. It resists removal. Being used is a form of survival. There is a gentle humor in imagining how this would have been received earlier. A building conceived to overwhelm, now appreciated for its ability to reduce discomfort. Time did not mock this outcome. It accepted it as efficient. The city learned something here without recording it. Not every effort needs to succeed in its original terms to be worthwhile. If something continues to function after its ambition expires, it has achieved a different kind of success. Time is skilled at finding these secondary uses. It does not preserve intent. It preserves effect. The effect that lasted was not awe, it was shelter. The people nearby adjusted naturally. They did not speak of adaptation. They simply noticed where standing felt better. Their bodies made decisions faster than their thoughts. Bodies respond to wind more honestly than minds respond to memory. This honesty simplified life. There was no pressure to treat the structure as anything other than what it had become, a feature of the environment that altered conditions slightly, in one direction rather than another. Night after night, this relationship repeated itself. Wind arrived, stone interrupted it. People stood where the interruption occurred. No explanation followed. Patterns formed without permission. This is how time teaches without instruction. It does not correct through force. It corrects through comfort. Anything that reduces strain tends to be kept. Anything that increases strain tends to be avoided. The structure no longer needed to justify its presence through scale or symbolism. It justified itself through small improvements to experience. That is a much quieter argument and a much more durable one. Time did not erase the past function. It simply stopped referencing it. The building did not forget what it had been built for. It simply stopped being asked. This distinction matters. Forgetting implies loss. Being released implies completion. The structure had completed its role as spectacle. Time assigned it a role as background utility and moved on. Background utility is not glamorous, but it is stable. It does not provoke strong reactions. It does not invite opposition. It exists below the threshold of concern. This threshold is where many old things survive. Above it, attention creates pressure. Below it, indifference allows continuity. The night embraced this indifference. Without the need to frame the structure as impressive darkness treated it evenly. Shadows softened edges. The building lost its outline and gained integration. Integrated objects are difficult to remove because they are no longer seen as separate. They belong. Belonging does not require admiration. Time understands belonging better than memory does. Memory clings to narratives. Time arranges conditions. The condition here was simple. A large object reduced wind. That reduction made nights slightly more comfortable. That comfort encouraged presence. Presence reinforced familiarity. Familiarity eliminated debate. No one asked whether the structure should still be there. Questions arise when things interfere. This did not interfere. It assisted quietly. The irony deepened with repetition. The more the structure proved useful, the less anyone remembered why it had been built. Its original intention dissolved into irrelevance, not through neglect, but through success of a different kind. Time did not need to destroy anything to achieve this. It simply waited. Waiting is time's most effective strategy. People change their behavior to suit conditions. Conditions remain. Over time, behavior reshapes significance. This reshaping is unsettling only because it reveals how fragile intention is. We invest heavily in reasons. Time invests lightly in results. The building once required interpretation. Now it required none. Its value could be felt without explanation. Wind either reached you or it did not. Stone either interrupted it or it did not. This clarity was comforting. There was nothing to argue about. No need to remember anything correctly. Experience provided the answer. The city continued to function within this adjustment without noticing its significance. That was appropriate. Significance had been downgraded. Use had been promoted. Time did not announce this promotion. It does not hold ceremonies. It alters habits until new habits feel inevitable. At this stage, the structure no longer belonged to history. It belonged to the night, to the wind, to the people who paused there without thinking. That is where time prefers things to end up, not in memory but in routine, not admired but relied upon. The unsettling part is realizing how little resistance this process encountered. No one fought to preserve the original intention. No one demanded restoration of former importance. Importance had already moved on. Time did not destroy the structure. It did something more efficient. It made the structure modest, and modest things last longer than impressive ones. As the night settled deeper, the wind shifted again. The stone interrupted it, as it always did. Someone stood nearby briefly and then moved on. Nothing more was required. Time had adjusted expectations. That adjustment held, the city rested within it, and the night continued. A night that did not ask to be remembered. Night did not arrive with intention. It never does. It slipped into the city the way it had learned to do over many centuries, without explanation and without expectation. The ground cooled gradually, the air settled. Whatever daylight had been doing quietly stepped aside without comment. Nothing marked the transition because nothing needed to. This was not a special night. That is the most important thing about it. It did not commemorate anything. It did not close a chapter or open a new one. It simply existed in the long sequence of nights that followed after the crowd stopped coming and stopped being missed. Near the old stones, everything behaved normally, which meant calmly, which meant without effort. The surfaces held their shapes. Shadows arranged themselves where they always did. There was no sense of anticipation. The city did not lean forward. It did not brace for memory. Places that have learned how to be quiet do not prepare for being seen. They do not rehearse. They do not gather themselves into meaning. They remain exactly where they are and allow the night to do the rest. The space near the former center no longer asked questions of anyone passing through. It did not suggest reflection or demand interpretation. It offered nothing beyond what it physically was: stone, ground, air, distance. That simplicity was not accidental. It had been practiced. Every night that passed without interruption reinforced it. Repetition smoothed away urgency. Familiarity removed curiosity. Eventually, the space stopped registering as something that needed attention at all. This is often mistaken for loss. It is not. Loss implies absence. Nothing here was absent. Everything remained. What disappeared was expectation. Expectation is heavy. It bends behavior. It requires performance. Once expectation left, the place straightened itself and rested. There was a time when this area would have been described carefully. Words would have been chosen to explain its importance. Routes would have been outlined, boundaries defined. Now description felt unnecessary, not because the place was unremarkable, but because remarking on it no longer added value. The night did not amplify anything here. It did not heighten drama or soften regret. It simply equalized. Darkness treated every surface the same. Old stone did not receive special consideration. Neither did newer walls. Everything was reduced to shape and presence. Sound followed suit. There was no background noise to fight against. Each sound appeared briefly and dissolved. A step. A breath. Wind passing through uneven space. None of it lingered. None of it built toward meaning. This absence of accumulation mattered. Without accumulation, there is no story. Without story, there is no need for conclusion. People sometimes assume that endings require punctuation, a final gesture, a closing sound, but here nothing ended. Activity had simply thinned until it reached a sustainable level. That level did not demand acknowledgement. The city had learned to live at this volume. Those who remained nearby did not notice the night as different from any other. That was the result of long adjustment. When change happens slowly enough, it disappears into routine. Routine does not pause to admire itself. Windows darkened, doors closed. Small movements concluded their daily usefulness and stopped. No one marked the hour. The city did not announce anything had finished. The irony is gentle but persistent. For a place once engineered to be unforgettable, its most enduring quality turned out to be forgettability. Not the kind that erases, but the kind that allows rest. Forgetting here did not mean neglect. It meant relief. Relief from being referenced, relief from being interpreted, relief from being expected to represent something larger than itself. This relief allowed the place to continue without friction. Nothing strained. Nothing reached outward. Everything remained in balance. Balance does not draw attention. It sustains itself quietly. There was no message embedded in this night, no lesson folded into the darkness. Anyone searching for meaning would have left empty-handed. The night offered no insight beyond continuity. That refusal was not hostile. It was indifferent. Indifference can feel unsettling when we expect engagement. Here it felt appropriate. The ground near the old stones had been walked so many times that its unevenness was known without thought. Feet adjusted automatically. Bodies learned the terrain long ago and stopped consulting memory. Memory had become unnecessary. The city did not hold on to what it had been. It did not compare itself to former versions. Comparison requires desire. Desire had faded. What remained was use. Minimal. Occasional. enough to justify presence without demanding explanation. The night supported this arrangement by staying consistent. No sudden shifts in sound or light. No interruptions. Just steady darkness that behaved predictably. Predictability calms the nervous system. When nothing surprises, vigilance relaxes. The city no longer required alertness. It allowed rest. This was not the rest of exhaustion. It was the rest of completion. The sense that nothing needed to be done. The idea that something important had once happened here felt abstract, detached, like a fact learned rather than a truth felt. Facts fade when they no longer influence behavior. No one standing here felt closer to the past. They felt present, entirely present. That presence did not invite reflection. It invited stillness. Stillness is not absence of movement. It is absence of urgency. Here movement occurred when necessary and stopped when it was not. The night did not demand silence. Silence emerged naturally. No one enforced it. No one needed to. This is how places survive long after interest leaves, not by being protected and not by being destroyed, by settling into a state that requires nothing. The city no longer waited to be rediscovered. Rediscovery implies hope. Hope implies lack. There was no lack here. Everything that remained worked well enough. A night like this does not end. It transitions into morning without commentary. Light will return gradually. Shadows will shorten. The city will continue exactly as it has been. Nothing will be concluded. That is the quiet strength of this place now. It does not require memory to exist. It does not depend on attention to remain intact. It simply is. The crowds are gone and they are not expected back, not because they are unwelcome, but because nothing here needs them anymore. This night does not ask to be remembered. It does not offer itself as a final image. It does not frame itself as meaningful. It passes. And in passing, it leaves everything exactly where it was. Calm, deep, slightly unsettling only because it reveals how unnecessary conclusion really is. There is no ending here, only continuation. And that continuation is enough.